So everyone, welcome to the Financial History webinar series 2021-2022. Today we have the pleasure and honor to host Maylis Avaro. Dr. Maylis Avaro will be presenting her paper, A Gold Battle, revisiting the history of the gold versus dollar hegemony during the Bretton Woods era. Maylis is a Swiss National Science Foundation postdoctoral fellow and invited lecturer at the University of Pennsylvania. She held previous visiting positions at the Department of Economics of Rutgers University, the Faculty of History at Oxford University, and at the Bank of France. Her research interests are money and banking, especially international currencies and central banking history. She holds a PhD in international economics and history from the Graduate Institute of Geneva. So, well, how the session will work, Maylis would have 30 minutes to present her paper, and then we will have a Q&A session. I want to remind you that this session is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, and shortly we'll be sharing our links and networks on the chat. Please save your questions for the Q&A session. We encourage you to open your mics and camera in the Q&A session, but of course we're also happy to receive questions via the chat, and we can read them out loud for Maylis. So Maylis, the floor is yours, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Sergio. Thank you also to Miguel, Manuel, and Paola for having me. It's a great series. I'm really honored to be presenting my work here. So this is an ongoing research on the gold and the dollar. So I'm really happy to welcome feedbacks and questions later on. So as a start, I'd like to make a little link with the unfortunate and dramatic actuality. So the Russian invasion of Ukraine is asking new questions and reopening the debate on the future of the dollar and whether these new events are going to shift the position of the dollar in the international system. And so some people expect that the yuan might become the key international currency or a competitive key international currency in the international monetary system. And today I want to bring you back in time history with me, and we will discuss one key episode of contestation of dollar hegemony back from the early period of the Bretton Woods, when dollar was a young key international currency compared to today. And so some background on the Bretton Woods period. So the Bretton Woods period, I call the Bretton Woods period the period of the Bretton Woods international monetary system, which was in place from 1944 to 1973. It was a system organized from the Bretton Woods Conference, and in this system, the dollar was key international currency, so directly convertible into gold, and other currency were tied to the dollar. So the dollar acted as a primary mean of exchange for international trade, and it was the most used reserve of value in foreign exchange reserves. So during this period, we see really the internationalization of the dollar. So on this map, I showed you how the world was divided during the period. So the 1960. So you see that all the light blue countries were in the dollar zone, meaning that they pegged the currency to the dollar and gold within this international monetary system. And I also showed you that some countries remain attached to European currency, and so these are mostly the sterling area country who peg the currency to sterling. It's mostly Commonwealth country and former British colonies or current British colony at that time. And then there was also a French franc area, so the franc CFA from the French colonies was tied to the French franc. So today in this talk, I'm going to focus mostly on European questions. in regard to the dollar. And more specifically, I will discuss the case of France, which has been seen as a spoiler or minor spoiler of the Bretton Woods system. And so why? Because there was recurring critiques of the US being able to run a balance of payment deficits during this period, thanks to the international role of the dollar. And so there is a key episode in the history of Bretton Woods in which the French made noise, and some may say made big consequences, so that's a bit of debate. So what happened? So you remember I told you the US dollar was the key currency of the system and directly convertible into gold, and other countries were tied to the US dollar. And so there was this pyramidal system with the dollar and gold at the top. And in early 1965, Charles de Gaulle, by then president of France, declared that he considered necessary that international trade be established not on the dollar, but on gold. And so this created a bit of an outcry, and a lot of ink has been used to discuss whether this French position calling for a return to the gold standard and the end of the Bretton Woods arrangement created instability in the international monetary system. So the motivation to study this event and understand why the France felt the need to contest this international monetary system. There are two main motivations. The first one is to understand why European country would be attracted to old gold versus dollar in the post-war period. And so there is a debate in the literature around this question. And some have said that already in these 50s and 60s, gold holding was obsolete and primitive and just a bad reminder or a bad memory from the interwar and early period. And others said that the to all gold in the 60s was not so irrational, because the dollar its value was maybe unstable or could be disputed, and so some said it was more like a portfolio choices. And a new paper by Eric Monet and David Puy showed that there was a memory effect from the country which were who last longer in the gold standard in the interwar period, that tended to hoard more gold in the post-war period. And this applies to France. So France, as you may know, remained until 36 in the gold standard in the interwar period. And so it could be this memory effect pushing France to try to come back to the gold standard. And then there is a second debate more specific to this French stance in the international monetary system. And looking at the literature on international relations, authors such as Gavin argued that it was anti-American political goal rather than sound economic objective that pushed the goal to issue such statements and to challenge the dollar position in the international monetary system. And other papers such as Michael Bordeaux and co-authors explain that this de Gaulle challenge of the dollar hegemony was a threat to induce the US to reform the monetary system and make it more symmetrical. So you remember I told you Bretton Woods was pyramidal, and the Bordeaux and co-authors argued that the French wanted to come back to a more symmetrical system where both the French franc and the dollar and maybe sterling or other key currency, the Dutch mark, would share the role of international currency of the system. And so in the same vein, Monet have argued that the French wanted to impose new rules of the game in the international monetary system and push adjustment policy and limit trade deficit. And finally, there is also a debate on the money doctors surrounding de Gaulle I want to address. And the key message so far has been that Jacques Rueff, a French liberal economist, was the key influence because he was a long time defender of the golden standard and pushed for a return to this, because they believe that the use of dollar as a key currency and the continuation of the US trade deficit will fuel inflation and eventually be negative for the stability of the international economy. And so for this paper, what I did is I focused on the dollar role of reserve. And so I studied the exact share of dollar and gold and other currency in the portfolio of reserves of the Bank of France. And then I complement these quantitative sources with more qualitative sources, and I use the gold papers and Treasury papers. And so this allowed me to build a high frequency data on the composition of the reserve of the Bank of France. And also I discuss not only the composition, but also the geography of deposits of gold reserves. And I will show you why this matters. And so looking at first fresh, what the data tells us. So here you can see the composition of the reserves of the Bank of France during the Gaulle presidency. So from 1958 to the late 60s. And so you see that in the first part of the presidency, both the gold holdings and the dollar holding increase at a similar trend. And you see a first break in this evolution from the summer 63, when gold keeps the gold holdings keeps increasing, but the dollar holding stabilizes. So there is a divergence in the evolution. And you can see that from the late 64 onwards, there is a net decline in the holdings of dollar and then a sharp increase in the holding of gold until the 1968 monetary crisis in France, when the Bank of France has to use its gold to intervene to support the French franc. So that's the sharp decline of gold holdings you can see at the end of the period. And so from there seems to be two shifts in the policy, and you can see really the Gaulle speech of the early 65 that I showed you before really had a real impact on the reserves on the trends of dollar accumulation in the Bank of France reserves. But if we look at the variation of dollar reserves, there was no net outflows of dollar from the Bank of France to the Fed during the earlier part of the period. So from 62, 63, 64, there was some net accumulation of dollar, but really 65 is the year when there is a net outflow from the Bank of France to the Fed gold window. So basically the Bank of France goes to the Fed and says, I want to exchange all this dollar against gold. And so the rest of the paper will discuss what was the motivation for such shift in the composition of the Bank of France. And so the overall context of the period is the adjustment problem of the US economy, because from the US onward, and a disequilibrium of the balance of payments. So they have a deficit, meaning they invest more dollar abroad than compared to the investment they are receiving. And so the gold backing of the US dollar goes below 100%, meaning the liabilities in dollar held abroad become more important than all the gold holded at the Fed. And so this creates pressure on the dollar. And then here comes into play the different money doctors around the goal. And so the key figure discussed in the literature I mentioned earlier is Jacques Rueff. So you can see the charming smile here. And so Rueff really saw the long run perpetuation of the US deficit as a cause of crisis, and keep calling for a devaluation of the dollar to force the US to accept its fiscal responsibility and adjust the dollar parity to the situation of its balance of payment. And we see multiple notes from de Gaulle, from Rueff sent to de Gaulle advocating for such move from the early 60s onwards. Yes, and then there is another actually opposing forces around the gold, which is a treasury. And so the key figures within the treasury are two high French functionaries, Henri Delattre and Maurice Pérouse. And they both try to limit Rueff influence and criticize Rueff work. Otherwise, they're actively calling for the devaluation of the dollar would be a major blow to the Western world and may cause a confidence crisis in the economy, in the monetary organization of the free world. And so you have to remember here it's a context of Cold War, and the French are quite scared, especially around the gold. They are quite conservative, so they really want the cohesion of the West Bloc. And in addition, there are some fear that if the dollar were to be devaluated, then it would become very expensive the French export will lose advantage, and they will become more expensive compared to US products. And so there is this conflict around the goal, and we can see Guillaume Guitenay writing to a British representative that maybe the goal didn't really understand the topic. Rueff was a prophet-like, and there was complete confusion around the French government position on this question of what to do with the dollar and how should we manage the French reserves. And so my argument in the paper is to show that Guitenay was not really telling the truth to the British, and that there was a clear-cut reserve policy management in the organization of the French reserves and us backing the gold position. I show in the results that the French feel like they are in a dollar trap. So what's a currency trap? It's the idea that you can expect a currency to devaluate, but you cannot divest from this currency because your divestment will increase the pressure on such currency, and then this will increase the probability of a devaluation. And so as early as 1962, I found in the gold paper that Treasury officials said the dollar has ceased to be a safe currency, and so the French should ask themselves whether it's appropriate to keep holding reserves. So we see that the idea of an incoming dollar devaluation is present in the analysis. But they are aware that the rapid conversion of the dollar would create losses. And it's interesting here is that the French draw the parallel with the 31 crisis. So what happened in 31? A community wrote a lot about this. So in 31, the French expected or foreseen the sterling devaluation, but they could not do much to protect themselves from the devaluation because they were a big player in the market, and if they were to exchange all the sterling against gold, then this would have just accelerated sterling devaluation, and so they fall in the sterling trap, as a community calls it. And so this sterling trap caused a capital loss of 2.35 billion francs for the Bank of France, and which was a technical act of bankruptcy because this loss was more important than all the capital and all the reserves of the Bank of France around this period. And so interesting to draw the parallel because the dollar holding of the Bank of France were quite large. And so a 10% devaluation of the dollar in 1962 would have actually caused a $10 million capital losses of the Bank of France. And this represented all its capital and its reserve. So the parallel between 31 and the early 60s in the potentiality of a dollar devaluation was could be seen as rational. And so they first find a quick fix to the dollar exposure. So what they did is that they decided to reimburse in advance some French long-term debt in dollars to the US. And this was a way to decrease their dollar holdings without attracting too much attention, because from the early 60s onwards, there is pressure on the dollar in foreign exchange market. And so the US organized the key European central banks in the gold pool and encouraged them to limit their conversion from gold into dollar. And then the key guilty event I discovered was the sterling crisis. And why sterling is key between dollar and France? It's because the sterling was maybe the lame duck, we could say, in the monetary system, because in the 60s, it faced a recurrent trade deficit, especially after the arrival of the new government from 64 onwards. And the Bank of England reserves were lower than the net liability held abroad in the form of sterling balances. And these sterling balances were actually inherited from the war and created a stability worry for the sterling exchange rate, because if sterling holder were to go to the Bank of England to exchange their sterling against gold or dollar, the Bank of England would not be able to cover all the liabilities. And so from 63 onwards, the Bank of France started to be really concerned that a potential run of sterling holders would create an important devaluation of sterling, and this could then contaminate the US dollar and damage the international monetary system and the system of fixed exchange rate. And their worry actually seems to be confirmed by the reality, because the tension of sterling keep increasing throughout the 60s. And because of recurring trade deficit of the UK notably. And so you can see here on this graph, the spot and 90-day exchange rate of sterling from 63 to 67, and you can see in the winter of 64 that sterling is really on the verge of devaluation. And so big speculation increased on the sterling after the election of the new government, and the sterling faced a confidence crisis on the financial markets. And so the US and the British coordinated to create a support program to provide liquidity to the Bank of England and help the Bank of England resist the pressure from the markets. And the US asked the six, so the European six, including France, to contribute to this liquidity program. And overall, a $3 billion support package was necessary to stop speculative pressure on sterling. And this really was too much for the French. And you can see that, right, that this, for them, this crisis and the fact that the US forced them and insisted for them to save sterling showed the fragility of the monetary system in the face of the crisis of the pound, and show that the collapse of the pound would bring a collapse of the dollar. So the idea that they would expect, the French says, that if the dollar was strong enough, then the sterling shouldn't contaminate, sterling troubles shouldn't contaminate. But in the French view, they feel these two issues going together and being strongly associated, then the dollar could not resist the sterling devaluation, and they see sterling devaluation happening in the near future. And de Gaulle says, for example, the pound is on this last leg, so are the British, and they see the dollar being the next in the line. And they are, de Gaulle and his government, they are quite annoyed to have to contribute to the support of sterling when the Britain is not resolving its trade deficit problem. And so he writes, that's de Gaulle saying it, we already have a lot of international participation, so here they are really reluctant to keep contributing to the support program of the Bank of England. All this support to the pound in the end will not be safe, and the dollar is starting to be shaken. So they see the support program of sterling being useless, and they think the dollar is next in line. Enough is enough. And so he says that the Americans should just have to do what they have to do to get their balance of payment back on track. So the idea here that de Gaulle really wanted for both the UK and the US to implement adjustment program and correct the deficit problem in order to limit the confidence crisis on the currency. And so they devised a contingency plan in the event of this event that they really see coming, being the devaluation of sterling followed by the devaluation of the dollar. And so they decide that they don't want to be exposed to the risk of devaluation of the dollar. So they decided just after the sterling crisis, so in December 64, to decrease the French exposure to the dollar. And so they decided to convert French dollar into gold, and they want to bring the share of dollar under 6% of reserve. And they decided that they would announce the conversion publicly in 1965 because the move being massive, the Fed, they wouldn't be able to hide such move to the Fed. But they still decided to make it as a gradual decline to avoid putting too much pressure on the dollar because of this dollar trap. They don't want to be the one creating dollar devaluation, but they want to protect themselves from the from the losses that could incur in the case of a dollar devaluation. And you can see from the graph here, I plot the share of reserve between gold and US dollar. The policy really reached its target. So you can see from, from 65 to the early 66, then there is this sharp decline of dollar. And then once this lower level target of 8% of dollar of the reserves is reached, they stabilize it. So it's really a rational move. Repatriate the French gold from the Fed to France. And this discussion, interestingly, starts early on. So from 63 onward. Oh, so did you lose me? Okay. So from 63 onward, the Bank of France was requested to bring back the gold, and they tried to argue that there was an opportunity cost, that having gold in the US was more interesting and easier for foreign exchange transaction, but the Treasury said it was a political decision, and so they forced repatriation of gold. And so you can see on these graphs the geography of gold reserves of the Bank of France. So you see a first decline of the gold held in New York from 63 onward. That's a blue line, and this is first accompanied by a rise of gold held in London and in Paris, and the idea here was to be discrete, so not to show that we were bringing all back to France, but just redistributing gold around the different financial centers. But from 65 onwards, they stopped being discrete, and they just massively repatriated all the gold from both the UK and the US to Paris, because they feel only then they would be really free to use the gold the way they would like to. And this decision was triggered in the summer '63 at the moment when Kennedy forced the Germans to stop gold dollar or dollar to gold conversion in exchange of its continued protection within the NATO organization. And so you can see here the gold outflow, and it's interesting to see again the discrete move. So first they were moving, all the gold leaving the Fed, you can see here, and you can see third they distributed the departure of gold from the Fed toward both the BIS account of the Bank of France in London, the Bank of France account at the Bank of England, and to the Bank of France. So first, the outflow distributed, and then from 65 onwards, as I said, they stopped to be discrete, and so they massively repatriate all the gold to France and to Paris. And so what were they fearing? And here again, we see that 1931 was the bad memory waiting on the French thoughts, and they fear that in the case of an imposition of capital control, France will be free to move the gold as they wish within or throughout different financial centers. And so was it wise? Was it a rational policy? So here it's interesting to note that the net liability of both sterling, so sorry, on the left is sterling and on the right it's dollar. And so you can see that for both countries, from 63 onwards, for the UK, for all the period, the liability are way higher than the Bank of England reserves. And for the US, the situation becomes the same from 61 onwards. So we could say that the US had a dollar balance similar to the sterling balance. But here it's really important to remember that these two balances did not rise at all from the same moment. And why? Because the sterling balance, you can see here, these very high UK liabilities, they come mostly from the war. So it's debt that the UK emitted to finance the war effort, and then that was held abroad and stayed abroad and was renewed and continued, especially in sterling area members, which had a limited option to divest outside of sterling. So the UK liability and the sterling balance were not really chosen, and they're really stable or declining throughout the period. On the contrary, and this will be my last point before concluding, for the US, we see that the liability are increasing. So there is a strong demand for dollar, and especially with the development of euro market, there are more and more dollars circulating, and so this demand for dollar limited the probability of dollar devaluation, and this is how the comparison. So I showed you this cartoon from a French media where they compare Uncle Joe with a UK figure saying, oh, you two have monetary problems, but actually they don't have the same problems because dollar balances were not sterling balances. And so I skipped that, but we can come up from discussion. Both the Fed and the Bank of England received some support. And so to conclude, here I'm trying to offer a new narrative of the gold battle between US and France, and I'm arguing that the fear of dollar devaluation was the main motive from the dollar conversion from 1965 onwards, and it was a bad memory of 31 devaluation and the confidence crisis in sterling that fueled the French worries. And so the distrust in US commitment to the fixed price of gold led France to conduct a costly operation to repatriate their gold from New York to Paris. And so then the debate is open whether we think the gold should be seen as a king dress. This is how the US describe it, someone just attracted to the shiny gold metal, or whether it's Cassandra, the one actually was mistaken or was proven true, because from 67, when sterling devalued, the pressure really falls on the dollar as the gold predicted. So I'll stop here, and I'm happy to take questions. Thanks.
Well, Mai, thank you very much for your great presentation. I'm already seeing some hands raised, so I'll just start. Let people ask their questions if you want. We do encourage you to open your microphones and cameras, if possible, your video, and or else we can just read out the questions for you. I'm going to start in order. We can take, I think, a round of 3 questions that I'm seeing people raising hands here, and then you can answer them, and we'll take it from there. So first, we'll start with William Allen.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, and we saw you for a bit, but we lost you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I thought it was an extremely interesting and illuminating presentation. My question is this, that when the Bretton Woods system was breaking up, there was quite a large body of opinion that thought that the technically correct solution would be to raise the price of gold in terms of dollars, but thereby also in terms of all paper currencies, so that in effect gold would be revalued, and that would help to correct the shortage of gold that was at the root of the problem to the Bretton Woods system. And that didn't happen, partly because it would have benefited the Soviet Union and France, which were big, Soviet Union and South Africa, sorry, which were big gold producers, but which were kind of politically unattractive. But the question is really, what was the French perspective on that proposal? Did they have any feeling of that it would be a good thing to do?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, okay, let's take all 3.
Okay, so next we have Professor Catherine Schenk. If you want to ask your question.
Great, thanks, Maylis. A couple of comments and a question. So the first one is that the French weren't the only ones who are thinking that if the sterling goes, the dollar will follow, really through the 1960s. And indeed, they were right, because when sterling did go in 1967, so followed the dollar. The second comment was that Jacques Rueff was touring the United States in the spring of 1965, March and April. And it's in April that he announced that he wanted a doubling of the value of the dollar value of gold. So that might be something to explore and add to your paper in terms of the politics of it. Also that Jacques Rueff was at the French embassy in London in 1931. So he really drew on that experience to be understanding what the end of Bretton Woods was going to look like. So that might be something else that you could add. And my question is, you haven't mentioned the gold pool, and you're kind of dating the fear of dollar devaluation to after that 1964 sterling crisis, or perhaps in 1965, as you've got in your conclusions. But really, everybody thought it was going to go from 1962 onward, and that was the point of having the gold pool to support the market value of the dollar. So why isn't that part of your story, I guess? I know the French had a funny relationship to the gold pool, but still.
And we have Dr. Mary Bridges.
Hi, Maylis. Thank you so much for the paper. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, I have a kind of historiographical analytical question, which is how do you figure out the role of domestic politics in de Gaulle decision making in your kind of analysis of the overall story? It really depends on what the advisors are saying to him and how he like the overall kind of calculations of international politics. And I just wondered where's the domestic political scene?
Okay, so regarding the rise of the price of gold, so it's a discussion maybe happening a little bit earlier. So I really focused this research on the early 60s. So I would need to double check to be 100% sure. But from what I remember reading, is that the main worry of the French when analyzing the whole system, the obsession for this period, is the disequilibrium of the balance of payments of the US. And they see even an increase of the price of gold would just be a temporary fix, because if there is no long-term adjustment, and then if the exorbitant privilege continues, so this increasing and strong outward investment of the US goes on, then the dollar balance will keep piling up abroad, and then even if the price of gold is raised, after a while, the tendency will catch up, so meaning the external liability will catch up with the price, with the gold value held at the Fed, and then the problem will reappear again. And so what they really wanted, and what they really kept emphasizing, was really this correction of the balance of payments. And they really discussed all the policies implemented by Kennedy as being too mild and not ask. They really want this austerity policy to be imposed on the US. And we could make the parallel that the French self-imposed such austerity at the beginning of the Gaulle period to stabilize the new franc and the French economy, even if this was not such a successful policy in the long run. But they kind of felt they made the effort to stabilize the French economy, and the French does have a small surplus throughout this period, and so they feel like everyone should do the same and bear the cost of an adjustment program. Regarding the French increment for your comment, Professor Schenk, I agree with you that the French were mostly the only one to think that, and I thought I put this little note in the conclusion where the US said, oh, but the French are just, the analysis is just some King Midas stream of gold, and it's irrational. But maybe we could actually, from some distance now, think that there could be some prediction or some wise French. But then here again, I would be cautious, because dollar troubles in the late 60s also happened because of increasing inflation in the US from 65 onwards. So the French fears of the early 60s might not be so much grounded if we regard the state of the US economy. For Rueff, thank you very much. I will definitely investigate these elements. But what I found really interesting when reading in more detail the Treasury paper and the De Gaulle paper is that Rueff doesn't seem to be such a big influence on the policy making of this question. And there are, so I found Rueff letters that people mention, like this note that he bombarded the Gaulle cabinet about. But then there are some critiques, and people say his analysis are actually over simplistic, and that he misses contagion to the global economy. So it's interesting to nuance and to going forward to really see what Rueff was used as, because I really saw the speech being, we have to return to the gold standard thing for the global, for the big need of reform, was a bit a hidden excuse in order to hide the fact that they really wanted to protect the reserve from the loss of an incoming devaluation. Because they were complaining about this disequilibrium of the Bretton Woods system since the early 60s. There is a lot of talk among the G10 and the IMF to reform, to address the problem of international liquidity, and they keep having the same kind of discourse about we need a reform. At some point, they proposed a new international liquidity. And so I'm not sure if Rueff is more just another voice to maybe to put some noise in the international discourse rather than really push on the gold pool. Yeah, for sure. So this is something I wanted to bring, and I just skipped because I was a bit short in time. So again, comparing sterling and dollar, so it's interesting to note that sterling received massive liquidity support in the form of short-term credit from the G10, the IMF, etc., to limit devaluation, and then the dollar. So support to the dollar was organized through the gold pool. So the gold pool was this group of countries which invested or will buy gold when the price of gold would be attacked, and vice versa. But actually, from what I read, France was, at least at the beginning, quite confident that the US would be able to stabilize the price of gold, and that the gold pool would work. And I really saw the shift when they see that the sterling contagion thing. So if sterling would have been fully stable and not a problem, then from what I saw in the archive, it feels like the French thought that the gold pool would have been enough to stabilize the price, at least maybe in the short term. And it's really the collapse of the sterling creating this snowball effect on market that would create this dollar devaluation. And on the role of the domestic policy, on this, maybe I can say that I see the goal being quite isolated, maybe in this own bubble. I don't see in all the policy papers I went through the Treasury of the Bank of France or in the Gaulle paper, I didn't see much interaction with other international thinkers. There is some comments about free work, but it's mostly in the line with the dollar problem. So they comment the world that is going in their own direction. And then it's the only slightly external actor I can see in this debate is Guillaume Guidney, who was a French official at some point at the BIS. So there's a very close bubble of the French thinkers. And only Giscard d'Estaing was more Atlantist and going toward the US, but he left from 64 onwards, and Pompidou went in. So yeah, there was a strong local bubble of thinkers creating or crafting these policies. I hope you answered the question, and I'm happy to clarify if it doesn't.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll make a couple of announcements in the meantime. If anyone wants to ask any additional questions, please let me know by raising your hands or by sharing them in the chat. And I want to take the opportunity to invite as we have her here, Dr. Mary Bridges will be our next presenter in April 11, and you can find the link to register in the chat. Also, I wanted to take the opportunity to let you know, to tell you a bit that we attended, and Miguel had a presentation about our network at the Latin American Economic History Congress last week, and we were sharing the message of the importance of having this network, and how we started during the pandemic, but how this has turned into something more permanent. So we wanted to invite you to give us ideas on what you would want to see happening in this space, which we want to maintain and keep. I think it's been a great opportunity for a lot of presenters across the globe, and also for us, the organizers. We've learned so much, and we built this network. So we want to invite you to give us ideas and take a more part, getting more involved in the activities and sessions that we have. So coming back to your paper, Maylis, I was wondering, because you're touching on a lot of topics, and at the beginning you started talking about Russia, for example, and the stability of the dollar as haven or reserve that central banks should have. That led me to think also about new currencies like central bank digital currencies. So, and also you mentioned contagion. So what would happen with the sterling if there was gonna happen some contagion? You're touching on different issues here. So I was wondering, in terms of public policy, what is the main message you're trying to deliver through the paper? Is it the dollar has suffered some periods of instability, but has nonetheless still kept itself as the main currency throughout all the recent history? Should we expect some changes? Was there really a possibility that the dollar or sterling would fail during your period of analysis with contagion? I'm still like a bit all over the place. I don't know if you have some more like specific ideas you want to push forward in terms of public policy or theory with the paper.
Yeah, I think my main takeaway here is this fact that a lot of people saw the French decision to come. So the key movement is the French deciding to go outside of announced, and both in acts and in words. But a lot of people saw this. So a lot of people. Can you hear me? Sorry, I think.
Yeah, we lost you for a bit. You're back. Yeah.
Okay. So a lot of people discuss this, especially in IR, as a contestation of the US economy, or de Gaulle wanted to be a leader in the global economy, or de Gaulle wanted to have like a more symmetrical system, so bring the French franc back to its glory, let's say. So there's a kind of a nationalistic, patriotic, old-fashioned de Gaulle. And what I was surprised to find is that it was. They say, okay, we anticipate sterling devaluation. We anticipate that such evaluation will lead to trouble in the international monetary system. And so let's discreetly convert our dollar. And so what I want maybe to push is that when a country makes some noise about some decision, what happened in the reserves can actually be, or the main decision to term of reserve might actually be more economics than shows on the first place. And I think coming back to today, it's always really risky to make parallels. But yeah, on contagion, you wouldn't want to be associated with a ruble today, and we saw some country from the former USSR bloc facing contagion with the decline of the currency following the decline of the ruble. And so that's maybe something to take away, like currency contagion was present back then and was a worry, and the fear and is still really present today. Yeah, I guess I will stop here.
Thank you. I don't know if we have any more questions from the audience. In the meantime, I would want to also explore a bit more on the methodological side of your paper. You present some series which look nice. I was thinking you could do some regressions, although I'm not suggesting that's the way to go. But I wanted to ask you if you could tell us a bit more about the archives and the methodological strategy you're using in this paper, especially to isolate the effects that you're looking at in terms of, well, you mentioned a couple of other things that were happening at the moment. Also, perhaps, I don't know, like the effect of the European economic community in terms of monetary policy convergence, or some other, you can think of a series of phenomena affecting this. So I want to understand a bit further what's your methodological strategy and how you account for these issues in here.
So far the paper is really focused more on intellectual history and understanding of this money doctor debate. So trying to see the power of ideas and how different economic ideas or different fears shaped policymaking. In here, the main object of study is the composition of the Bank of France reserve. And actually, the next step for the paper would be to then study whether, because I have this high frequency data on dollar conversion, whether this there was some impact in international gold market. And so I will so there could be some regression happening in the future in the paper, so stay tuned. But so far it's mostly international intellectual history.
Well, thank you very much. I don't see any more questions, but we do have actually an announcement for a call for papers from Professor Catherine Schenk for a CR conference in Frankfurt at the end of June on banking and financial history in troubled times. I don't know, Catherine, if you want to make tell us a bit more about it.
Thanks. Sorry, I just kind of stuck it in there. I thought that this audience might be well connected to be submitting their own papers, or indeed those of others. It's just a reflection on banking and financing crisis and wars and the sorts of things we're dealing with now. So Maylis' paper really kind of reminded me of that. So thank you.
Thank you. We will be sharing it through our networks. Well, I think this is part of what I was just mentioning a while ago, in terms of we want to make the most out of this, not only the webinar series, but the network itself. So definitely we'll be sharing that call for papers. I think it fits perfectly in our audience. And well, Maylis, I want to thank you once again for joining us today. It is indeed a great paper, and I think we all look forward to seeing what happens with this in the future. And thank you all for attending. We're looking forward to see you in the next session with Mary Bridges. Thank you all.
Thank you very much for the organizer, and thank you for everyone attending. Thank you.